This hearing is the second in a series of hearings by this committee to highlight on a bipartisan basis the Chinese threat to American economic and security interests. Today's hearing is dedicated to the threat posed by China's industrial, financial, and economic strategy, as well as Beijing's hostile acquisition of American research, innovation, and intellectual property. To help us highlight this threat posed by China, the committee welcomes four leading experts. Michael Brown is the former CEO of Symantec and co-author of a Pentagon study on China's technology transfer strategy. Michael Pillsbury, director of the Center for Chinese Strategy at the Hudson Institute. James Phillips, or Jim Phillips, is chairman of Nanomech. And Alyssa Kania, I say that correctly? Also Kania, from the Center for New American Security. As a reminder to our members, we are and will remain in open session. This hearing will address only unclassified matters. To our guests in the audience, welcome. We appreciate your interest in today's hearing. We expect proper decorum will be observed at all times, and disruptions during today's proceedings will not be tolerated. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. For many years, the committee has warned about China's aggressive acquisition of the intellectual property of the United States and others around the globe. Specifically, China is targeting our innovation base through both legal and illicit activities, including espionage, state-sponsored theft, forced technology transfers, and the evasion and violation of U.S. export controls and the use of backdoors to encryption technology. The committee has led efforts to strengthen the authority of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's also called CFIUS, an interagency body that reviews transactions for national security risk. Transactions from China form a significant part of CFIUS's work, and Congress should give CFIUS the ability to ensure China is not posing a national security risk through acquisition of sensitive U.S. assets. Meanwhile, there is no level playing field for U.S. businesses in China due to Beijing's economic coercion, regulatory discrimination, and use of state subsidies to prop up domestic firms. America's strategic competition with China involves economic, military, and technological domains, and it is important to note that the competition is playing out in fundamentally different ways from the U.S.-Soviet competition during the Cold War. The United States and Soviet Union had minimal interaction in the economic and academic spheres as the two sides maintained strict barriers to mutual trade and academic exchanges. Today, by contrast, the United States and China are deeply intertwined in economic, trade, academic, and other realms, posing unique challenges for the United States across a range of areas. By stealing our innovations, China is gaining strategic, economic, and military advantage while advancing its ambitious goals to dramatically increase its force projection capabilities in Asia and beyond. Previous administrations avoided direct confrontation with China, failed to mitigate Beijing's activities, or to fundamentally improve bilateral relations, and were continually hampered by a failure to properly account for the crucial role of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. It is vitally important to understand how Beijing has aggressively sought to consolidate economic power under the centralized authority of the CCP. The party has systematically exerted its influence within state-owned enterprises, gained more control over non-state-owned enterprises, and advanced ambitious initiatives across multiple critical economic and technological sectors. Make no mistake, China's private and state-owned enterprises are all ultimately subject to the decisions of the Chinese Communist Party. America's major challenge is shaping how U.S.-China competition will develop over coming years. Our committee's efforts will be focused on sharpening our understanding, building awareness, and informing the public and U.S. leaders so that we can continue to get our policies right. While much of the committee's work will be, by necessity, remain classified, the committee hopes this unclassified hearing will ensure that Congress, the administration, and the American people are fully aware of the growing challenges posed by China's activities. With that, Mr. Schiff, the ranking member, is recognized for his opening comments.
I thank the chairman. Before we turn to the subject of the challenge posed by China, there is another issue that our committee members wish to raise concerning a more proximate threat from Russia. As we have all borne witness to over the last few days, the president had I think charitably can be described as a disastrous summit with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. And one of the issues that has come about as a result of the public comments he has made during that summit is what took place during the private 2-hour meeting that the President had alone with Mr. Putin. This is an extraordinary circumstance in which the President did not want his National Security Advisor, John Bolton, present, did not want his CIA Director present or his Secretary of State present, but instead chose to go into that meeting alone. It appears that there were commitments made in that meeting that affect American national security interests. It also, I think, is incumbent on us, given what the President said publicly that was of such great concern to our country, to our NATO allies, that we find out what was said privately. For that reason, we moved to subpoena the interpreter to come before our committee. I regret that we have to raise this at today's hearing. We have requested a business meeting next week, but that request has been declined. This may be our last opportunity before we go into an extended recess to vote to subpoena the interpreter and find out whether there are any other national security problems that arose from this meeting that the U.S. Congress needs to be aware of. It is our motion that the interpreter be subpoenaed to come and testify in closed session before our committee. And I would like to yield to Mr. Swalwell for the purposes of...
Did you make a motion, or?
I am making a motion, yes, and I would like to...
This is, as you know, Mr. Schiff, this is a hearing, and the only motion you can make is a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Chairman, my motion is that we subpoena the interpreter, that we have her come and testify in closed session. This is an extraordinary remedy, I realize, but then it's extraordinary for the President of the United States to ask all of his senior staff essentially to leave the room and have a private conversation with an adversary, and then in a public conversation disavow his own intelligence agencies and in many respects disavow his own country. Under those extraordinary circumstances, I think this remedy is warranted, and I move that we subpoena the interpreter.
Second.
So the gentleman has made a motion pursuant to the public notice of July 11th, 2018. Today's committee meeting was noticed as a hearing to gather testimony related to China's threat to American government and private sector research and innovation leadership, not the transaction of business. Accordingly, the chair cannot entertain such a request.
Mr. Chairman, I appeal the ruling of the chair and ask for the ayes and nays.
I don't. The chair has not made a ruling, but a denial of recognition. I'll give you 3 minutes for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I appeal the denial of recognition.
The chair has, well, I'll give you an extra 30 seconds, so you have 3 minutes left for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, are you refusing to allow a vote on the ruling of the chair?
The gentleman is aware. This time we'll call the committee into recess. Okay, we'll bring the committee back into order, and I will recognize Mr. Schiff for the purpose of making a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Swalwell and I move that the interpreter that was present for the private 2-hour meeting between the President and Vladimir Putin be subpoenaed to appear in closed session before our committee.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Conaway.
Mr. Chairman, I move to table the gentleman's motion.
Gentleman has a motion to table the gentleman's motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed?
No?
No.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Nunes.
Aye.
Chairman Nunes, aye. Mr. Conaway.
Aye.
Mr. Conaway, aye. Mr. King.
Aye.
Mr. King, aye. Mr. Lobiondo. Aye. Mr. Lobiondo, aye. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Ross-Layton. Aye. Ms. Ross-Layton, aye. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner, aye. Dr. Wenstrup. Dr. Wenstrup, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford, aye. Mr. Gowdy. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik, aye. Mr. Hurd. Ranking Member Schiff.
No.
Ranking Member Schiff, no. Mr. Himes. No. Mr. Himes, no. Ms. Sewell. Mr. Carson.
No.
Mr. Carson, no. Ms. Spear. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell, no. Mr. Castro. Mr. Castro, no. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, no. Mr. Chairman, there are 11 ayes and 6 noes.
All right, so the motion is tabled. I'll recognize Mr. Schiff for the purpose of making an open statement. Mr. Schiff is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset of our May hearing on the military dimension of the challenge posed by China, we discussed devising responses that will safeguard our national security and economic well-being. There can be no doubt that the centerpiece of the international order over the next several decades will be, in many respects, the relationship between Washington and Beijing. Some are likening this to a new Cold War with China replacing the Soviet Union as our global rival, but there's a marked difference between China and the USSR. Throughout the 70 years of its existence, the Soviet Union never posed a true economic challenge to the United States or the West. Consumer goods were chronically in short supply and shoddily made. Soviet agriculture was notoriously unproductive, while the tech sector was devoted almost solely to the military. Finally, the corruption and ineptitude of Soviet planners contributed to the stagnation of the Soviet economy. By the late 1970s, it set the stage for the demise of the USSR in 1991. China, on the other hand, has built a dynamic economy that has been growing rapidly for several decades and which has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty and made Beijing a world leader in both manufacturing and technology. China's GDP has grown by more than 1,000% since 2001, with a similar rise in defense spending. This has allowed Beijing to assert itself with increasing confidence in Asia and beyond. Beijing has accomplished this both by unshackling its economy and through significant government intervention that has focused resources and attention on strategic sectors. At the same time, China has explored, while acquiring technology through domestic research and development, through strategic acquisitions and investment in foreign technology and natural resources. On the one hand, we must do more to police China's ability to invest in or outright acquire American technology. Congress is considering the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, which would broaden the jurisdiction of CFIUS. It would also give CFIUS more power to investigate and potentially block foreign transactions by expanding the definition of critical technology and CFIUS's jurisdiction. On the other hand, we should also revisit whether and how the United States catalyzes its own research and development and how we can ensure that crucial investments are made, especially in the context of an economic paradigm that too often prizes short-term profitability over long-term viability. We very much look forward to the testimony of the witnesses before us today, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ranking member yields back. With that, Mr. Pillsbury, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I wrote a book called The 100-Year Marathon, trying to put on the record, with permission from CIA and the FBI and DOD, both the American side of how we got here and our relationship with China, especially involving technology and economics and trade, but other matters as well. The book was redacted. Some of my best stories were taken out by CIA and FBI. I, of course, complied with that, but they left enough in the book to let me tell the story of why we have gotten where we are today with China. One of the factors is, in fact, a series of highly classified meetings between American presidents and their Chinese counterparts to make agreements which were not disclosed to the public or to Congress for 30 years. In the book, I have a number of those agreements referenced and either quoted from or put online. In the beginning, we should have known, and I blame myself here too, we should have seen the Chinese drive for economic growth and their turning to America as a strategy. Instead, it looks like at the time it was thought of as an auxiliary event compared to the geopolitics of balancing the Soviet Union. Looking back, we can see the Chinese interest in technology transfer, sending students to America, a whole series of actions that grew and were never opposed by the American side. So where we find ourselves today, I mean literally today, the Chinese ambassador here in Washington has published an op-ed piece this morning. He reviews the various allegations, both from Congress and from the Trump administration, about illegal technology transfer, espionage. It's quite a long list. In fact, the latest White House report lists 50 of these practices. According to Ambassador Cui this morning, this is all false. China has engaged in nothing like this. He denies everything. There have been 2 or 3 articles in the last few days in the Chinese press going over specific allegations and denying them. Now, he says anyone familiar with Chinese history knows that pressure doesn't work for our nation. Trade bullying will only backfire. Where this leaves us is that it's going to be very difficult to negotiate an end to these Chinese practices in light of what they have, I hate to use this phrase, but what they have gotten away with over the last 40 years. And the fault is not just China. Obviously, if you look back on some of the early FBI publications, unclassified publications, as early as 2000, the FBI was sounding the alarm. An institution was created, we referred to jokingly as the Bingo Club, to try and track Chinese illegal technology acquisitions or industrial espionage. That's a long time ago. There was no CFIUS reform in those days. There was a strengthening of the FBI's offices in California where this tended to occur, and there were an increasing number of prosecutions. But I'm not a panda hugger. I'm not trying to be pro-China, just holding out from the Chinese point of view. This is only recently that they've been called on this conduct. So that's one reason we're going to have a very hard time stopping these practices. A second theme of my 100-year marathon book has been our misunderstanding, including myself, of the Chinese belief, deeply held belief, that they deserve to be number one in the world. There's a quotation recently from which I got the title 100-Year Marathon. It's a book called The China Dream, which President Xi takes seriously and has praised. In that book, he refers to a 1955, the Chinese author, refers to a 1955 statement by Chairman Mao that China's destiny and China's historical contribution to all mankind will be to replace the United States of America as the number one economic power in the world. A number of Chinese economists have backed this up. Over the last few years, there's been 2 famous books in China. One is written by a gentleman, very high-ranking Chinese, who has a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He became the chief economist of the World Bank. His forecast is that China will be double the American economy in about 10 years, and it will be triple by 2049. I mentioned 2049. That's the end of the 100-year marathon. It's believed by the Chinese authors to start in 1949. So the other book by a Chinese economist named Huan Gao has a similar projection. In other words, the China dream, not to be spoken aloud so the Americans can remain asleep, one Chinese general told me, but the Chinese dream is on course. It's to surpass us where they see a period of what they call danger. The dangerous period is as the Americans begin to wake up and realize that they're going to be number two, they might take what the Chinese call reckless action. That's the phase I think we're in today. But slowly, as the Americans begin to realize that they're only half of the Chinese economy, the Americans will come around and accommodate to reality. This is how I understand Ambassador Sui's op-ed piece this morning to be, that they're going to deny this. They have opened the door slightly. Yes, China might buy more American exports. They've offered as much as $60 or $70 billion increase next year, but that had a condition to it. It was an offer only active if the Americans put no tariffs at all on Chinese products. So we obviously have blown through that. There's a number of other issues that we can get into, but my book is about how deeply held these beliefs are in China, how long they've gotten away with this, and a kind of a warning I've given to my friends in the Trump administration that please don't underestimate what we're dealing with. The kind of feistiness you can see over the last 2 months in the Chinese media is they're almost spoiling for a fight. They claim that they will set up an institution that will take the taxes they get from the tariffs on American products and use those to compensate Chinese companies. So we're dealing with a very, what's a good term for it? A good negotiating opponent. The other theme in the book I go through where there were some redactions is the cooperation between the US, CIA, and the DoD and their Chinese counterparts. We worked together in 1982 to try to drive the Vietnamese army out of Cambodia. There was a base in Thailand where there was joint training. We worked together in Afghanistan, where the Chinese provided, we paid for, through CIA funds, $2 billion of Chinese weapons to be transferred to the Afghan resistance. There was another program in Angola, and I describe in the book a number of other foundational events of cooperation between the US intelligence service and the Chinese intelligence service. This is very little known, but it provides a strategic foundation for cooperation between the US and China that I think will endure through the trade disputes. However, how we're going to get them to confess what Michael Brown has learned, what Jim Phillips is going to talk about, what I believe is in the works of, in the published record by scholars, I do not know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pillsbury. Mr. Brown, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Nunes, Ranking Member Schiff, and members of the committee. I'm pleased to be with you today to share my understanding of China's systematic plan to transfer technology. I came to this work as a former CEO of 2 Silicon Valley companies, Quantum, a computer storage provider where I worked for 20 years, and Symantec, the cybersecurity firm where I was CEO through fall of 2016. At that time, I began serving as a Presidential Innovation Fellow, working for the Defense Innovation Unit, Experimental, DIUX, in Silicon Valley. However, I'm here today in my personal capacity and not as a spokesperson for the Defense Department. In 2016, I co-authored a report on Chinese investments in venture-backed startup companies. We found that Chinese firms participated in a record 16% of all venture deals in 2015 and remained at 10% in 2016 and 11% in the first 10 months of 2017. This is concerning for several reasons. First, the growth of these investments is up substantially from a level of 1 to 6% in the period 2010 to 2014, and it's accomplished through more than 500 Chinese-based or affiliated entities, those investments. Second, the technologies where Chinese firms are investing are the same as where U.S. venture capital firms are investing: artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, augmented reality, blockchain, genetic engineering, et cetera. Third, since venture investing depends on deal flow, investors see many more deals than they invest in. As a result, it's likely that Chinese investors in aggregate have seen upwards to 1/3 to 1/2 of recent U.S. financings, venture financings. so they have a broad view of innovation across a range of technologies. Therefore, it's both logical and probable that China uses this broad view of U.S. innovation as a vantage point from which to target specific technologies, the underlying IP and know-how, as well as the key talent developing them. Once targeted, China can deploy one of 10 different technology transfer mechanisms, both legal and illegal, to bring this technology to China. Fourth, by investing in early-stage technology companies, Chinese investors are learning about these technologies at the same time and at the same rate that we do, which precludes any time-based advantage for U.S. industry or the U.S. military. Fifth, before the proposed FIRMA legislation, there was no monitoring, reporting, or control of investments in technologies important for national security. And lastly, the Defense Department will tend to avoid contact with early-stage technology companies that have a significant level of foreign ownership, even if the company is developing technology important for national security. Chinese venture investing is just part of a larger story of technology transfer to China, ongoing for decades through both legal and illegal means, including industrial espionage, cyber theft, forced joint ventures in exchange for access to the Chinese market, tracking of open source innovations, sponsoring professional organizations to target talent, and using Chinese foreign national students by placing them to work in sensitive areas of U.S. research. Viewed individually, the legal practices may seem benign, but when viewed in combination and at the scale China is employing them, the composite picture illustrates the intent, design, and dedication of a regime focused on technology transfer at a massive scale. In my submitted statement, I provided two specific examples of IP theft. American Superconductor, a wind turbine company whose software control code was stolen by Sinovel through Cold War-type industrial espionage, and Duke University example, where a Chinese foreign student stole research sponsored by the U.S. Air Force to start a successful company in China now selling to the PLA. Today, 1/3 of all foreign students in the U.S. are Chinese, and 25% of our STEM graduate students are Chinese foreign nationals. Some have access to research funded by the U.S. military and work in our national laboratories, as enforcement of restrictions varies at universities, but in general, the academic environment in the U.S. is open. We have the worst of both worlds with large numbers of Chinese foreign nationals. We allocate a large number of our limited capacity to Chinese students, and our immigration policy today turns them away once they've graduated. In a study released a year ago, the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property said the annual losses from IP theft range from about $225 to $600 billion. This wide range indicates we do not have our arms around the problem, except to say that the scale is massive. The U.S. government does not have a holistic view of how fast this technology transfer is occurring, the level of Chinese investment in U.S. technology, or what technologies we should be protecting. The U.S. needs a sense of urgency in developing 4 remedies. First, better defensive tools such as the CFIUS reforms included in FIRMA and expanded and updated export controls. Second, more aggressive investment of IP theft with sanctions on Chinese firms that steal, such as ZTE, and changing our laws so that Chinese firms can be successfully sued in U.S. courts, along with the ability to attach their assets if found guilty. Third, increased FBI counterintelligence resources with a change of objectives to prevent the IP theft rather than prosecuting cases. And fourth, a long-term game plan to be successful in the technology race we now find ourselves in with China. Let me conclude with 2 important points. First, any of the steps we take to deter technology transfer from China, which includes CFIUS reforms and changes to export controls, needs to be coordinated closely with allies to be effective. Otherwise, we simply create an incentive for talent and companies to move offshore. Second, while defensive measures like CFIUS reform and better export controls are important, they are not key to winning a technology race with China. Winning that technology race means we must invest in science and technology, ensure Americans pursue STEM education, and increase federally funded R&D. To enable the U.S. to win the last technology race with the Soviet Union, federally funded R&D was 2% of GDP in the 1960s. U.S. federally funded R&D has declined today to 0.7% of GDP. We must improve our technology base and innovation capability. Thank you for your attention to this important issue, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Phillips, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome. Mr. Phillips, could you grab your mic real quick? There we go.
Okay.
Chairman Nunes and members of the committee, my name is Jim Phillips. Thank you for inviting me here today to appear in front of you. It's a rare privilege to have the opportunity to comment to you on the importance of deep science manufacturing, the constant threat of international cyber warfare, and especially from China, and the importance of proper immigration policy relative to attracting and retaining in America our future Einsteins and Wernher von Brauns, and restoring U.S. competitiveness quickly to revitalize our most important economic engine of innovation. I've had the privilege to be involved in leading some of the most exciting developments in the digital revolution, such as the invention, development of instant messaging and broadband with the invention of the cable modem and several others. Most are predicting that more will be invented over the next 5 years than in the history of mankind. This is a major inflection point. The world is at this inflection point, and massive technology invention acceleration has been caused recently, and the acceleration by the inventions of the chip, software, storage, and the internet. The colossal supercycle of innovation commands that America take action immediately to respond to many challenges presented by China or suffer the consequences. Technology is pervasive, and technology is always a reflection of society. I now serve as Chairman and CEO of Nanomech Industries, a leading nano manufacturing firm and research company with hundreds of advanced material science products used by many of the largest iconic customers in the world, especially in oil and gas, military, trucking, automotive, aerospace, marine, and retail. We basically make atoms work smarter and harder. Nanomech is a highly innovative material science-based nanoengineering firm based in Northwest Arkansas with a portfolio of international award-winning inventions and commercial products, including breakthrough innovations in machining and advanced manufacturing, lubrication and energy, aerospace, biomedical implant coating, strategic military applications, such as the next generation U.S. Army combat uniform. We are poised for dramatic expansion of our inventions that are very revolutionary, that join the fortress of over 2,000 patents and claims. The world runs on machines, and machines run on lubricants and coatings. There are 10 machines per person today, and that is expected to increase to 100 machines per person within 10 years. All the problems left in manufacturing are at nanoscale, and all the solutions, therefore, are at nanoscale as well. The United States is locked in a moon race with other major countries trying to take advantage, trying to take advantage and the lead in materials, digital, and bioscience platforms via nanoscale engineering, research, development, and commercialization in what is sure to be the next industrial revolution of progress. While these competitive countries lost out to an extent to the revolution in progress in IT, they are determined to put enormous amounts of public and private capital to work to win this even more important race in nanoengineering that undergirds many of the inventions such as just described in terms of big data, AI, electronic and autonomous vehicles, robotics, and significant weaponization, very significant weaponization. Everything we make can be weaponized. To live well, a nation must produce well. Some manufacturers believe the global competition has made them stronger, more productive, and more competitive. Gains in productivity and output, however, are not translating into broader economic gains for the United States. The model of invent it here, make it there is not working at all to advance the economic interest and national security in the United States. The U.S. production ecosystem has been devastated over the past decade, and we must rebuild it in order to feed our engine of innovation, in order to compete on a global basis. We have developed advanced nanolubricants, Atom Oil, Atom Lube, that dramatically reduce friction for machines to the point of near zero, and thus deliver extraordinary performance and energy savings by having machines last as long as decades longer, even leading to the birth of new types of machines. This work supports multiple industrial sectors, including superior operating heavy machinery, trucks, advanced machining, safer, much safer and more productive things like trucking and ensuring American energy independence, automotive transportation, wind turbines, aerospace, and many more. In addition, the company has developed advanced nanopaints that can survive the most hostile conditions and suits that are antimicrobial, antibacterial, antifungal, antimold, antimildew, totally super hydrophobic, and totally fireproof for our soldiers. Could save hundreds of thousands of lives. The policies, programs, strategies, and business models that worked in the past are inadequate to secure America's future in the digital and nano age. U.S. manufacturers face the likes of China Inc. and others who operate as a gigantic monopoly, funneling massive government capital and resources into a select one or few state-run companies, without regard to normal costs for good working conditions, health care, regulatory, including environmental regulations, et cetera, as opposed to the typical U.S. manufacturer, both small and large, competing in their own country against scores of others who find themselves at huge disadvantages, building their manufacturing companies from scratch, absorbing all costs up front, including developing IP, safeguarding it, dealing with massive regulatory, R&D, factory design, build-out to code, legal expense, and seeking and finding growth-friendly investment to find the business and compensate a great management team. With the new tax laws and reductions favoring manufacturing in the U.S. by this administration, fortunately for America, manufacturing in the United States is barely beginning to turn more positive. Many firms are recalculating their total cost of production to take into account these changing conditions, which is slowing down and stopping offshoring. Talent is absolutely the key for manufacturing and national competitiveness. Moving forward here. It is at this point in my testimony I want to reveal to you as a practitioner, entrepreneur, and CEO of an American deep science manufacturer that I report to you, Nanomec, in all of our efforts to grow and prosper in this great American capitalistic system, has had to face down China and others in real threats and actions. Not long ago, the FBI showed up in force at Nanomec Industries headquarters to report to us that they had observed we were the second most hit firewall in the Chinese, by the Chinese cyber militia in the southern United States. Millions of hits per day. The FBI were at Nanomec to help proactively under the directive of the National Nanotechnology Initiative signed into law by President George W. Bush, to protect and promote the interests of American nanoscience. The FBI brought in experts from China to assist in how to confront these serious attempts of cyber hacking that we're experiencing. We involved at significant cost our IT firm, and as fast as possible took many new precautions in addition to double firewalls, triple firewalls we had in place, and since we were having to add all the software and physical security provisions and fortresses. We are told that the only way by the FBI to be totally sure you are safe from hacking by the Chinese and others is to go off the grid with your most secret proprietary property in the form of logbooks using a certain method under advanced lock and code. We have done so in certain cases to protect our most secret inventions and research. We've also been advised by our leading IP law firms to never, ever file patents in China as we globalize our IP portfolio. We are told by our top law firms that the Chinese patent system is totally corrupt. It's time for America to lead. Some, even many perhaps, question whether America has the resolve and resources to right its own ship, let alone lead a global recovery in manufacturing. I believe steadfastly that the challenges are solvable and the Americans and their leaders will summon the will to act decisively. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. With that, Ms. Kanaya, you're recognized.
Chairman Nunes, Ranking Member Schiff, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the threat of China's attempts to exploit the U.S. innovation ecosystem and its challenge to U.S. leadership in science and technology. In recent history, U.S. predominance in innovation has been a vital pillar of our power. In this new era of strategic competition, the U.S. confronts a unique, perhaps unprecedented challenge. China's quest for indigenous innovation has often leveraged and been accelerated by tech transfer undertaken through licit and illicit means. Its track record of industrial espionage and those activities ongoing today have been extensively documented, and cases abound. Once, it would not have been inaccurate to say that Chinese indigenous innovation seemed to be an oxymoron. Today, however, it would be arrogant, perhaps even dangerous, to claim that China can't innovate, given ample evidence to the contrary. Given today's risks and threats to American research and innovation, from Silicon Valley to our nation's leading universities, it is imperative to pursue targeted countermeasures against activities that are unlawful, unfair, or at best, quite problematic. At the same time, justified concerns about constraining China's tech transfer and espionage must not distract from the core challenge to ensure U.S. competitiveness at a time when China is starting to become a powerhouse and would-be superpower in science and technology. Its national champions in AI, companies like Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, are global leaders in the field that also benefit from strong state support while supporting national strategies such as military-civil fusion. Chinese scientists have launched the world's first quantum satellite, broken world records in quantum computing, and even claimed to have achieved progress in quantum radar, which could potentially defeat stealth. China's ambitions and techno-nationalism should be taken with measured skepticism, but also quite seriously. However, China continues to confront considerable challenges, including shortcomings in human capital and core technologies. These deficiencies motivate the going-out strategies of Chinese enterprises, as we've seen, and their attempts to draw tech and talent back to China. Such efforts, as we've heard today, are extensive in scope and scale. My written statement includes a number of specific examples. Overall, the deep engagement that exists today between U.S. and Chinese innovation ecosystems often creates opportunities for U.S. companies, but such entanglements and interdependence also create a level of risk and vulnerability. It can be quite difficult to distinguish between initiatives and investments that are primarily commercial and those guided or directed by the Chinese government. As scrutiny of investments increases with the proposed reforms to CFIUS, China's tactics for tech transfer will likely adapt and obfuscate. China's presence in Silicon Valley and Boston's biotech sector also includes incubators and accelerators that provide even more direct access to tech and top talent. Concurrently, Chinese companies have pursued highly targeted acquisitions focusing on robotics, genomics, and semiconductors, among other prioritized sectors. Turning to academia, American universities, particularly those that engage in sensitive research, have been a major target of Chinese cyberespionage. In certain incidents, U.S. research and educational institutions have also been exploited in ways that are problematic or may even contribute to Chinese military modernization. These dynamics illustrate the need for greater awareness of these threats and security on a case-by-case basis, including through enhancement of counterintelligence capabilities for prevention and reaction will be critical going forward. It's also vital to ensure that appropriate safeguards will be incorporated into U.S.-China research partnerships and scientific collaborations. To conclude, here are some final reflections. On balance, the U.S. has benefited tremendously from the openness and inclusivity of our innovation ecosystem. In today's world, it is also vital to temper that openness with clear-eyed recognition of the risks and benefits of our current engagement and entanglement with China. Our policy responses must be commensurate with the scope and scale of these threats and challenges, but also must be nuanced and targeted to mitigate the risks of collateral damage to our own competitiveness. Looking forward, the U.S. must recognize and reinforce our enduring advantages as well, through policies that strengthen our innovation capabilities. These include a focus on STEM education, increased investments in basic research, and a genuine openness to welcome talented students, scientists, and entrepreneurs, including from China. The U.S. must not only defend itself, but also go on the offensive, not just fearing competition with China, but rather embracing it. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation this morning.
Thank you very much. So I'll start with a couple questions. One of the issues that we're probably going to look at in our next hearing will be China's economic investment globally in major sectors around in countries around the globe into all the major sectors within their economies, and that creates a pathway for them to gain power. However, one of the things I'd like to look at, because I know, Mr. Pillsbury, you've talked about a lot of this, but it's in U.S. investment dollars that have went to China that have ended up helping the Chinese build out their infrastructure and possibly even military infrastructure. And I know some of that's in your book. I haven't read your book yet, but I'd like for you to maybe, if you have any examples of that, I'd be interested to hear any of those examples here before the committee today.
The examples are plentiful. There is actually no bilateral investment treaty between the United States and China. It's been under discussion for 30 years. It's been under negotiation for about 10 years. The Chinese have a list they call the negative list. It's areas that the United States or other countries cannot invest in. They also have a preferred list. This comes out in the read my book first, but you should also read the USTR report, March 22nd, 2018. Extensive witnesses, Chinese documents that are translated, go into how they attempt to guide foreign investment into China into sectors that will not so much benefit the foreign investor, but benefit China. And it's quite a sophisticated system that seems to begin with the Chinese Academy of Science. They will pick a sector. Nanotechnology they picked out at least 15 years ago. And there's a wonderful interview where a Chinese returned student holds up a nanotube and says he got this at UCLA together with his PhD. He was then attracting successfully foreign investment in nanotechnology in China. So I mean, that's not the only example, but it's the system that I'm pointing to. And frankly, there's even examples where you would think Americans would not invest, like the dredging in the South China Sea to create essentially illegal features in the area. This is a massive company, Chinese company that does this. It's a state-owned enterprise, but it also accepts investment. And U.S. companies have invested in that dredging company, even as it conducts these activities. So
You're saying the dredging company that created some of the islands that just popped out of the water, where
Yes.
there was American investment into those
Yes.
companies?
that's right. It's completely legal. It's a question of strategy, geopolitics. Does the Congress want to permit this kind of activity to go on? And the answer in the last 40 years has been yes. American direct investment in China is a good thing. More recently, because of Michael Brown's report, Jim Phillips' concerns, your publications, I can't pronounce your first name correctly, so I keep not pronouncing your first name, but the academic community and the FBI have been sounding the alarm on where this is all going. And frankly, one of my biggest concerns is space technology. Senator Barbara Mikulski fought valiantly to make sure that NASA and the International Space Station did not have Chinese involvement. But more recently, the Chinese are pushing harder and harder. They've even got a movie called The Martian, where they show how the Chinese space program rescues the Americans. They're pushing very hard to acquire some of our most sensitive space technology and to get Americans to come and invest in these companies in China and to bring the high technology with them. So the concrete examples you're asking for, Mr. Chairman, I would say there are more than 100. What we're going to do to stop this is probably going to depend on the Congress, because the executive branch that I've been associated with working for these decades, the executive branch is sort of stuck on autopilot. This investing to help the Chinese in sensitive industries to better compete with America is a good thing. I don't know if you looked into National Science Foundation's budget, National Science Foundation agreements with China. They provide our most recent scientific discoveries to China, often within 60 days. National Science Foundation has an office in Beijing to do this. So what we're talking about is blessed activity up to date by the Congress and by our national thinking about China.
Well, Mr. Pillsbury, I'd be interested in those companies, learning about some of those different companies, if there are any other funds. I'd be fascinated to have those. I don't know if you could maybe provide those for the record at a later date, but we'd like to have that. And I want to, because I know we're going to run out of time here, so I'm going to cut my questioning short, and I'll recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pillsbury, it's fortuitous that we have you here today. I understand that part of your research has involved secret agreements reached between President Nixon and China and Congress's efforts to undertake to find out what those agreements were. Can you shed a little light? I assume those circumstances were different, that it wasn't the American president meeting privately and alone with the Chinese leader, but what success Congress had in finding out or not finding out about these agreements. And Ms. Kania, I wonder if you could help us prioritize. China's using a lot of different methods to acquire U.S. technology, some cyber theft, some financial investment in American firms or European firms to acquire the technology that way. Other techniques, sending foreign students here to study and come back. How would you have us prioritize our defenses in terms of those Chinese efforts, acknowledging that we also have to step up our own game, let alone play defense?
Not to joke about serious matters, but it may amuse you to know that both Dr. Kissinger and President Nixon relied on the Chinese interpreter. So there was no American interpreter who could be subpoenaed. These documents that you're referring to were kept secret.
And that may be the case next time.
These documents were kept top secret, eyes only, for about 30 years. The efforts of a non-government organization that's affiliated with George Washington University brought these documents to light, in part through lawsuits and threats of lawsuits. Actually, George Soros was one of the funders of this group. It's called the National Security Archive. And I'll give you one example of what had been concealed for 30 years. Dr. Kissinger and President Nixon in their memoirs said Taiwan was not discussed in all of these meetings. It was really geopolitical, counterbalancing the Soviet Union. When the long transcripts were finally obtained by the Congress and the public, it seemed that Taiwan was a major topic. President Nixon had written out in advance what he would say, that Taiwan is a part of China. Now, this is not our policy today. We have something called our American One China policy, and we continue to maintain that Taiwan has a legal status that is not part of China. We don't take a stand, or it'll be worked out someday in the future. But President Nixon had said this to Chairman Mao, speaking as an American president. That was one of many examples. It's not just President Nixon, by the way. There were a similar set of agreements by Jimmy Carter to transfer American technology and welcome a number of initiatives. They didn't come out for roughly 30 years. In fact, some of these documents are still classified under the control. No researcher can have access to them without permission of Dr. Kissinger or Brent Scowcroft. In the case of even more recent agreements, they remain unavailable, is my understanding, to the Congress and to the public. So this is an old issue under our Constitution. Can the president maintain secrecy from the Congress on highly sensitive foreign policy matters?
Thank you, Mr. Pillsbury. Ms. Kania.
There is no single or simple solution at this point, given the complexity of these issues, but as you mentioned, it is important to prioritize, and in trying to break down the categories of activities, investments, as we've heard, can provide good situational awareness that can inform future targeting, but not necessarily direct access to tech if there are appropriate safeguards in place. What's received less scrutiny so far, but may be more concerning given the opportunities for more direct access to tech and talent are, for instance, incubators and accelerators being stood up in innovation ecosystems like Silicon Valley and Boston, some of which are supported directly by the local Chinese governments or by the Ministry of Science and Technology, and some intended to become centers for tech transfer or describe themselves as bridges between the US and China in terms of enabling the flow of that tech and talent back. So I think that those are mechanisms that require greater scrutiny going forward. In addition, I'd add that in terms of some of the activities of US companies and universities, given the high-tech nature of a lot of these technologies, I think we're reaching a point where for China, IP theft alone has diminishing returns, and really gaining access to the latent knowledge and talent and gaining access to sensitive research is vital. So there's a focus on, for instance, encouraging U.S. companies to set up joint laboratories in ways that could be mutually beneficial but could also become problematic, to set up research and development centers in China. And I think a number of these mechanisms are certainly will require greater scrutiny, and I'm happy to provide further details from my testimony for the record. A couple of examples I'd point to pursuant to, for instance, Chinese government talent plans. There have been active efforts to recruit leading scientists and encourage them to return to China, and in some cases support institutions linked to military technological developments. We've also had students who are actually members of the PLA or have studied at PLA universities actually come to the U.S. to study abroad, and recently one quantum scientist returned to, quote unquote, devote all of his energy to the cause of strengthening the military after pursuing postdoctoral research at Stanford. And I've had U.S. scientists, including one who had received funding for research in bionic robotics from the military, also become involved in laboratories in China that do support dual use in military technological development. So clearly, an expansive landscape of activities. Happy to provide further details going forward, but I think really recognizing cases where there is truly direct access to tech and talent, and in terms of countermeasures, I think certainly greater enforcement as well as greater outreach to academia to raise awareness of these risks and threats, including, for instance, through more institutionalized mechanisms for consultation with the FBI going forward. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I think, and I'd also add it's important, I think, to prioritize going on the offensive, as we've discussed, to really affirmatively increase our innovation capabilities.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
When he goes back, Mr. Conaway is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony this morning and a pretty clear-eyed statement as to this transition that we're in between our relationship with China. When made in China was a derisive phraseology. We were arrogant and asleep at that. Seeing that transition go from where it was to where it is today, how does a nation that founded on the basis of respect for law and order, the way the United States is, and our open society, come to grips with a nation, a peer nation, and soon to perhaps be a above peer nation that appears to have no respect for the rule of law? You had that op-ed this morning from the Chinese ambassador. You had Xi Jinping stand at the Rose Garden in 2015 and said they would absolutely not arm those features in the South China Sea, and public reporting shows that that was a flat-out lie. I suspect he knew it at the time. A recent front page picture of a Chinese warship with an array of Chinese admirals on the bridge, and the photo focused on Xi Jinping. You couldn't distinguish him from the other combat folks because he had the exact same combat gear they did. It's been a long time since I've seen an elected, democratically elected president wear military uniforms like that. And so how do we come to grips with this guy? They don't have the same kind of reciprocity. They've got hundreds of Confucius institutes on our nation's, in our nation's colleges, and I suspect a democracy foundation opportunity in the universities in China would beat with some resistance going forward if we try to do that. They won't allow us to invest in lots of things that we clearly allow them to invest. But most all of our dealings are dealt with on one other thing on this trade issue. Massive cheating. They agreed to do certain things with respect to a session of the WTO. They have cheated across the board. They're 5 years behind on reporting what their cheating is. They're bound to do that. So we only know what's 5 years old, and it dwarfs the cheating that most of us suspect was going on. So how do, in fact, we deal with someone who does not have respect for the law and order, does not respect any agreement that they do, as long as it, once it becomes difficult or unadvantageous for them to agree or to abide by the agreements, and they just simply stop and go a different direction? How, in fact, can we deal with a country like that? Or should we?
I'd like to take a start and make 3 points. The first is we have to work with allies closely to bring enough economic scale so that China can't simply write an op-ed and say the U.S. alone, through bullying, that's their words, not ours, is going to be effective. If we combine with the $55 trillion of GDP represented by a group of allied countries who are all at the effect of these Chinese mercantilist policies, that's going to give us the best economic heft to have the ability to influence their policies. The U.S. alone, I don't believe, is large enough to be able to accomplish that. Second, I think we ought to prioritize by going after what's illegal that China's persisting in. So that's cyber theft and industrial espionage. We don't have enough resources aimed at even understanding how big that problem is. So we certainly don't have enough enforcement activity. And we can see how difficult the enforcement activity is through the example we're looking at now with ZTE. So we need to have resolve. We need to go after the illegal activities. And third, as we've already talked about, we can't win this technology race by just thinking about defense. We'll have to go on offense and think about all the policies that are required to ensure the U.S. remains number one.
I can follow up on that. You know, what we don't have stolen from us, and it is stolen every day, we typically give away as a nation to China. One of the greatest areas where we're losing billions of dollars every day in tax dollars is we have these great universities, and they are a great university system, the best in the world. We have the best national labs in the world. But there's a gigantic weakness, and that is in the tech transfer commercialization side of our laboratories and our universities. So you've got billions of dollars coming down from NSF, NIH, Department of Defense. They're coming through these pedagogical universities, laboratories, and so forth. And while we're paying maybe $40 million to $100 million on a university campus for football, and I love football, you know, our tech transfer office may get a paltry $1 million, $2 million, and yet the president of that university is going to expect a Gatorade a week in terms of innovation. And so, unfortunately, this is a huge stranding of intellectual property. And what happens is that typically you have very, 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 very few of our incredible science projects ever see the light of the day. And what happens is it moves very quickly to what's called publish or perish. And then we're publishing our very best science out of our universities, national labs, literally onto the internet, giving it free to countries like China. And, you know, it just doesn't make any sense to the extent that could be moved from ideation to invention to innovation to full execution, commercialization, and we could have the lead on innovation, not only now, but on a permanent basis. And all that translates to GDP. And the winner is not going to be through wars anymore. It's going to be through GDP. It's going to be the country with the best jobs and the most jobs. And you're going to get that through the system I just described. We have to improve tech transfer, commercialization. A lot of the people, typically the people are well-meaning, they're wonderful people, they've never run a company that run our tech transfer commercialization offices, they've never had the experience of entrepreneurism or even promotion. And to that extent, it absolutely strands itself, even though we've got, through the funnel of the United States, billions of dollars going into the universities, billions going into the national labs, and we just don't see it hit commercialization owned by the United States, delivered by U.S. corporations. It's a major, major problem.
Well, Chairman, thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Himes recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all. Good morning for being with us. I want to direct my questions to Mr. Brown and Mr. Phillips because I want to keep tugging on this cyber thread and ask you the question in two categories. So in cyber espionage, attacks on commercial assets, but also more in the national security, defense, and offensive capabilities. The American public might be forgiven some confusion about where the Chinese stand. We saw, obviously, the indictment of PLA officers under the previous administration, an agreement to reduce cyber espionage, which may or may not have worked. So I'd love to get, in both realms, the state of play. Famously, a DoD annual report to Congress in 2017 said China believes its cyber capabilities and personnel lag behind the United States. That was the DoD's opinion in 2017. Is that still true? Where are we in those two categories of cyber activity?
Not being a spokesperson for DoD today, I can't comment on DoD's current feeling on that, but we can say that it's well documented that there are 250 to 300,000 PLA members who every day wake up with the mission of exploiting what can be gained, not only from the U.S., not only what can be gained for
Commercially?
national security reasons. That's exactly my point, Congressman, is they're focused on what can be stolen commercially to benefit companies that have support of the Chinese Communist Party, which has already been said by Chairman Nunes. That really extends to all companies within China. There's really no separation, even though some have closer ties, state-owned enterprises being a prime example. So I think cyber theft is just one of a system of technology transfer mechanisms, one of the illegal ones. But I think we have to look at this as an entire system of how they're transferring technology as we think about what we want to do to thwart that.
You know, we're approached constantly by China to sell our products into China. You know, early in the negotiation, you find that if you're going to sell your products into China, that part of that goes to, they require you to give up your technology. They want you to expose your technology. And it's just not possible to really conduct business with China without giving away your science and your technology, especially if you're a small, mid-sized company, which is typically where most of your leading-edge innovation takes place. It's an incredibly unfair system. We don't do that type of negotiation because I've worked with both multi-billion-dollar companies as an executive, smaller companies, and we don't require that they turn over our science and technology in order just to buy their products. But that's the way it's done in China. So beyond the problems we have in tech transfer and cyber warfare that's amazingly bad, all this talk about Russia, I mean, I've been watching it on the TV. Russia's nothing. It's a zero. We need to quit talking about Russia. Russia's like 1.5 trillion. It doesn't even add up as a competitive company in GDP. There's a real war going on. It's a cyber war like never before, where they're invading the United States every day, trying to take over the United States in terms of all our science technology. If they're not stealing it, they're imitating it, or they're trying to get it through other means like I just described. Russia's a nobody. They're off the charts. And they really are not doing any of these things to the extent that they don't really have that kind of economy. The super economy that's surpassed in the last 10 years the United States is China, and we need to pay attention to China. Russia is virtually nobody.
If I might chime in as well quickly, because I've conducted some fairly extensive open source analyses of Chinese cyber forces and capabilities, and I'd be more than happy to provide further details for the record. I think it's clear that while China may have lagged behind the U.S., and at one point Chinese hackers were better known for the clumsiness of their operational security and the wide-ranging extent of their activities than their actual sophistication, I think we're seeing that start to change, both with the creation of the PLA Strategic Support Force, which has integrated and consolidated space, cyber, electronic, and psychological warfare capabilities, as well as the shifting of some of those commercial cyber espionage activities to the Ministry of State Security. Just within the past couple of weeks, there was a major breach at a U.S. Navy contractor was exposed that resulted in the theft of highly sensitive data related to U.S. electronic warfare, as well as weapon systems under development. So that was, I think, something that truly highlighted that even U.S. contractors engaged in some of the most sensitive of research are still vulnerable and still regularly targeted pursuant to these activities. And I would also add to reinforce some prior points that some of the American enterprises that have the most sensitive technologies and are really at the cutting edge, such as startups and also university research that's quite advanced, are also some of the most vulnerable to targeting via cyber espionage, given that they often don't invest in defenses and have limited awareness of cyber capabilities. So I think we do, in prioritizing countermeasures, we do need to focus on cyber defense, and we need to focus on disrupting Chinese cyber operations, and we need to recognize that despite the Xi-Obama agreement, we've seen an evolution and transformation of the threat rather than a true attenuation of it, both with the enhancement of Chinese military cyber capabilities and ongoing activities, particularly by the Ministry of State Security, to continue to target sensitive IP and data.
Thank you. I'm out of time, so I can't ask another question, but in a second round, I want you to help us with one thing, which is, it's hard to know what the path is if you don't know what the end game is. Mr. Phillips, you said win. Mr. Brown, you said we're number one. What is what is the end state we want? Is it 1950 when China is irrelevant and economically weak? Is it a U.S.-UK situation where we fight a war and 200 years later we're partners? I don't have any more time now, and I appreciate the chairman's indulgence, but in a second round, I really want you to paint a picture for this committee about what a win looks like. Thank you. I yield back.
I did submit a 27-page report that does have that in it.
I was going to say, if we don't have time for that, it'd be if you guys could submit it, the gentleman's question in writing, if you get a chance. Thanks. Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the witnesses for this hearing, because to me it's necessary to shine light on how China is using its unfair predatory investment practices to steal American ideas and innovation and undermine 75 years of an American-led international order. I believe, though, one issue that deserves increased attention is greenfield investment in the United States by Chinese state-owned companies, which, of course, greenfield refers to construction of a manufacturing facility from the ground up. And we're talking about companies that are an extension of the Chinese government and Communist Party. And to me, there are significant concerns that Chinese state-owned or financed companies are using greenfield investment to skirt investment review processes and gain full access to U.S. markets, undercutting U.S. companies and U.S. workers in our backyard. I know there's an example recently of a Chinese state-owned enterprise which announced it was going to have a $1 billion investment in Louisiana to build a chemical manufacturing facility with promises of new jobs. And typically, this company has total financial backing from the Chinese government and used government subsidies. And yet, a few weeks ago, they announced they were reconsidering their investment because of increased costs due to tariffs. They also admitted publicly they were planning to manufacture the chemical facility in China with cheap Chinese labor and cheap Chinese steel, and then ship it back to Louisiana for final assembly. I guess, to me, this use of cheap Chinese steel and labor is bad for our economy and bad for American workers, especially steel workers, welders, and blue-collar jobs who are being harmed by unfair Chinese trade practices the last 3 decades. We know that China has been doing this. However, they now bring their investment, the predatory investment practices, to our shores. So I guess I would like, starting with Mr. Pillsbury, just ask do you see a distinction between Chinese greenfield investment and investment from other companies, other countries, and do you believe the U.S. government should be more stringent on greenfield investment by Chinese SOEs?
To answer your question specifically, I think it is all the same China Incorporated entity that's behind this. It's not some sort of separate SOE strategy compared to greenfield investment. I do think this committee has the authority to request from the intelligence community an assessment of a number of issues that I would advocate you actually do this. One of them goes back to the cybersecurity question, who is ahead in cyber intrusion? But the other gets at your question, Congressman King, that what would it take for us to succeed in negotiations with China to get them to stop this misconduct? We already know they're going to deny it. We know they have a lot of supporters in the United States. Mike Bloomberg, Henry Kissinger, Hank Paulson have already announced they're forming a new organization to kind of help China. They want to have an annual conference. You may have heard the phrase billionaires gap. There's a billionaires gap. China now has more billionaires than we do. Their billionaires tend to be quite anti-American. Our billionaires tend to take a very different public stand. We have both Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have a project now in China that's based on goodwill and assuming the best intentions. There are a number of other billionaires. There was a profile of Steve Schwarzman in the New York Times that he is President Trump's close advisor on China, gave some of his views. The 4 of us here today do not represent this group. And until the intelligence community declassifies more of studies, until both the Senate and House Intelligence Committee ask what are China's weaknesses? How can we succeed in making them stop these measures? I'm quite pessimistic. So I'm happy to provide some examples for you of how the greenfields investment, in a way, is equally dangerous to us, to our standing as world leader. But our billionaires would disagree with me. And there's I believe the number is 540 American billionaires, 580 Chinese billionaires. So if you look at public opinion and things that the executive branch has been condoning, you have to be pessimistic until there's congressional action.
You know, make no mistake about it, that we are totally at war with China right now. And a country's GDP, which is what it's all about, is the most important leading indicator. So as it goes, its increase and decrease, so goes jobs, spending, tax base, and then everything else. Unless there's a miracle, unless we get busy right now with this committee, with Congress, China will vastly exceed the GDP in the United States if it doesn't already. I mean, depending on some measurements. At that point, China will have the new world, leading over the same period. China will be the new leader of the free world, free or otherwise. China will be in control. America's reign as an economic leader of the world will be over. Will be over. This is very, very serious. So are the designations of the place with the best jobs in the world. It won't be the United States anymore. And leader of the free world. It won't be the United States anymore, because America will no longer have a disproportionate financial advantage that gives it the moral, economic, and the leadership authority it has now. When this happens, America loses. The world changes. Everything changes. But it won't have to use its military. Everybody, looks at military. Everybody looks at Russia. I cannot believe what we're doing with Russia at this point in time. Russia doesn't even make the playing field at this point. When its GDP surpasses America's, China will dominate the world economically by a margin far more than the United States has, and at that point, China will be in total control.
If I might quickly build upon some of those points, not all Chinese investment is risky or problematic, but I would say that it certainly can be, although there in many cases are benefits to American workers and companies when we do have foreign direct investment. The difference in the case of certain Chinese activities is that they can be directed and exploited by the Chinese government and Chinese Communist Party in ways that are often opaque. So I think certainly greater scrutiny of these issues, and also recognition that they're global in scope and scale, as we've mentioned, which makes coordination with allies and partners imperative, because solving the problem here doesn't get us any closer to a solution if these activities certainly shift. And with its One Belt, One Road strategy, for instance, China is truly looking globally in its ambitions, both economically and geopolitically.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce to the record a column by our former colleague, Senator Jim Talent, on Greenfield investments.
Without objection. Ordered. That the gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Sewell is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. There should be no doubt in this room that Chinese cyber espionage, forced technology transfer, and the state-backed purchases of American companies pose an urgent and critical national security threat to the United States, as well as obviously affecting our bottom line in terms of our economy. Since World War II, American investments in research and innovation have given our nation's workforce a competitive advantage in the global marketplace. And the technology and ideas produced by the research that made the United States Armed Services the most powerful military in the world. But now China is forging a shortcut to its technology frontier, and that shortcut comes at the expense of the United States. That's what we're talking about today. The essential question for the United States policy is how we can keep our workforce and our military a step ahead when China steals our intellectual property and national defense secrets. I believe that one advantage that we have that is non-transferable is our relationships globally. And frankly, I'd love to hear your thoughts about whether or not the current administration's trade policies, which tend to be towards tariffs and levying these tariffs against China, is in some way helpful or harmful when we think about the global implications to our bottom line GDP and to our competitiveness going forward. I personally think that the president did no favors by undermining our relationships with our allies and propping up relationships with those folks that mean us harm and have shown to mean us harm. So I'd like to actually get to the question that Congressman Hyams suggested. What is the end game? And most importantly, how do we get there? And whether or not I'd love to know your thoughts about whether or not our current policies towards trade are helpful or harmful in that process. Can you start, Mr. Phillips?
Sure. It is a very bold move by President Trump to take on tariffs. and, try to, in some way, reach an even playing field.
Yeah, but when you have,
they-
I represent Alabama, and Alabama has a lot of global automobile manufacturers. I
Gotcha.
can tell you that we're quite concerned by the thought that he may be proposing a 25% tariff on automobiles and automobile parts that are being imported when you represent companies like Mercedes-Benz, Hyundai, which are in my district, and they make these cars in Alabama. They're made in America, and the imposition of that, we're really afraid will jeopardize jobs in Alabama. I guess my question really, though, is what is
Do
the...
you want an instant fix, or do you want a fix that's going to take longer than maybe 1 quarter? And that's what it comes down to, because if you look at last year in China in terms of the difference in trade, we exported $130 billion to China. China exported $530 billion to the United States. They've been doing this for decades. That's why they're able to go to coral reefs and at the expense of billions, maybe trillions, create new military bases to take over
I understand
South
that.
China Sea. Now, to the extent of your question on tariffs, will America have the willpower to go through a few quarters, in terms of negotiation on this? Because, if we don't, then we're going to continue to see, and I've talked to CEOs of the major companies like Ford and so forth, and it really bothers them that they're, if you go to, for instance, South Korea, a Ford has a 35% tariff leveraged on it when it goes to South Korea. But a South Korea coming to the United States, we only leverage 5%.
I understand, but I think
and
that
there's no way to be competitive
I only have limited time. I
on a
wanna
global
reclaim my
basis
time.
if we
And
don't have
Mr.
some
Brown,
type of tariffs.
what do you have to say about that?
I think there's no way to get back to 1950, where Congressman Himes talked about, where the U.S. is that large a proportion of the global GDP.
So what's the end game?
So the end game is, how do we thrive in an environment that we help foster in the U.S. That is based on rule of law and the freedoms that we enjoy? That requires working closely with our allies
Yes.
to make sure that we are reinforcing that rule of law. That means reinforcing institutions like the WTO and maybe strengthening some of the enforcement so that the activities that are illegal, we have better ways to have consequences, because right now China doesn't see the consequences of the mercantilist behavior that they enjoy.
Thank you, sir. What about you, ma'am?
Tariffs are a tool, a source of leverage perhaps, but not a solution or a strategy, and we do need a much more comprehensive approach to this challenge going forward, and one that avoids collateral damage to our own competitiveness in the process. Say that this is not a new Cold War. We are much more deeply interdependent and entangled with China, and we have to think quite seriously about how do we manage the risks and benefits in ways that enhance our own innovation and enable the U.S. to truly thrive going forward in a very complex and competitive world. And this is not necessarily a zero-sum game. I agree we need to have much better enforcement. We need to impose costs and consequences when there are activities such as cyber espionage that are clearly illegal. We need to have better oversight and scrutiny of engagements or entanglements that are quite problematic. But I think we're really just at the start, and I think we need to think about crafting a much more well-rounded approach overall, and one that does involve close coordination with allies and partners, because we can only gain the requisite leverage and start to resolve this problem if we think on a global scale.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Last question before we go vote will be Mr. Lobiondo. You have okay, Mr. Lobiondo is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. So it sounds like we have a war opening up on multiple fronts, but while it's very dangerous, obviously, in all of these areas, could you tell us what you think are the several most dangerous areas for us, most critical areas for us, that while we're not going to pay attention to everything or we're really getting our lunch eaten on, that we have to be careful of?
I'd like to start. I think the most important thing we can do is recognize we're in a global technology race and make sure we're investing in our own capability and capacity for the future. So of all the defensive things we could talk about, the most important thing is we go on offense. We've won technology races in the past. We've got to employ those techniques again, investing in ourselves, STEM education, federally funded R&D, the ability to commercialize innovation, and make sure we stay on the forefront.
America is not short on innovation. We're the leading inventor in the world. It's not that we don't invent. We out-invent everybody. In the meantime, China manufactures, steals, and monetizes. And we have to wake up to that. I heard in the very opening of this committee meeting today that we've been asleep at the wheel. and the United States has. And we have to recognize that, you know, everything's changed. It's not a war of bombs. It's a war of cyber warfare, and it's also a war of GDP and jobs. And the one that has the most GDP and the jobs is going to be the clear winner. And we have to take all the measures, both the positives that Mike just described, but, you know, also we have to take other measures. And they may even include tariffs. It may hurt a little bit to have a few tariffs. But are we willing, do we have the willpower as a nation to try and create more of an even playing field through things like tariffs that are temporary, that are part of a negotiation scheme, part of a strategy to win again? Otherwise, it's all China.
Okay. I had additional questions, but in deference to my colleague, Mr. Turner, I'll yield the balance of my time to Mike.
Mr. Lobianto, thank you. That's very kind of you. Ms. Kanya, thank you for your statements with respect to that there is investment that we do want to attract. In my community, we have an auto glass manufacturer, Fuyao, employing several thousand people in my community. Obviously, that's not a danger investment. That's the type that actually is important. We want to encourage. Mr. Brown, you mentioned ZTE. I have limited time, so I'm going to actually split two questions. If you could talk for a moment about Huawei, ZTE, and the danger of their infrastructure being in our communication systems so that we shift from not just hacking, but to a continued Chinese presence that could be a threat. And then if you could do that in a minute, and Mr. Pillsbury, if you could talk about, I understand you've looked at the issue of Chinese propaganda and messaging. If you could, you know, they steal our IT, they cheat with respect to trade, but how is the discipline of their propaganda and messaging affecting us? Mr. Brown.
Yeah, Huawei ZTE represent a strategy that China's been very successful at to support national champions. So how can those companies go out and become leaders on the world stage? And they do that by so many of the mercantilist policies of protecting those folks at home, giving them subsidies, et cetera. Then that makes them more competitive worldwide. As you're alluding to in telecommunications, that's particularly problematic because that gives a government the capability to have access to the communications that are global. So this represents a particular danger, but I would just say it's an example of a strategy that China has in mind with many industries that are well documented in Made in China 2025.
If I might chime in quickly as well, I would say that Huawei and ZTE clearly are national champions that have received strong state support and also have links, as many companies in China do, to the Chinese Communist Party and to an extent to the military in ways that are far from transparent and have raised some questions and concerns, including on Australia, where these debates are quite extensive. Huawei has been linked to a major data breach at the African Union headquarters, so I think certainly they have a lot to answer for on that front. And given that they are pursuing pilots and partnerships really around the world, including in a number of our allies and partners, the potential leverage that their construction of this infrastructure could provide, or the opportunities for espionage going forward, really represent a major challenge. And
It would be very,
5G
damaging. Yes, Mr. Pillsbury, propaganda.
Just very briefly, I would say the issue of Chinese influence operations inside our country is perhaps the trump card of all of their sub-strategies. They still enjoy a great deal of goodwill with our media, in Congress. There are, as you say, there are investments that we welcome from China. When they bought the Waldorf Astoria for $3 billion, who can object? And they play on a concept they call the magic weapon. I would advocate this be a separate hearing, but the magic weapon concept is that Chairman Mao wrote an essay in the 30s. The enemy of China you leave alone. The best friends you leave alone. You fight for the broad middle. You fight for those who don't know what to say, don't know what to do. And China has, according to FBI testimony, China has developed a $12 billion machine to do just this. It's received some attention. The Hudson Institute released a report a few weeks ago about this. In both New Zealand and Australia, they've uncovered fairly major operations to influence the parliament and the executive branch. And that's a model right now for what the FBI, as I understand, is looking into. Is this underway inside the United States, inside Germany, in Britain, in France? The answer appears to be yes, but this is like a cutting-edge area of both research and intelligence analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. We have time for just a couple minutes. Mr. Swalwell is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, I want to focus on the attribution a couple years ago of the Chinese hackers. You know, for the first time, our Department of Justice indicted hackers abroad, knowing that it'd be unlikely that we could pick them up on an Interpol red notice, but to send a message as far as deterrence and to maybe inhibit their travel. Have we seen a change in their behavior since that attribution and the Obama administration directly confronting the Chinese and saying that there is a difference between, you know, espionage and IP theft, that we will draw a line between the two?
So to my knowledge, we have not seen a change. And
So they're still aggressively going at us.
as you know, that was one of the subjects that President Obama talked with Xi about, with an agreement that the cyber activities would be used for national security and not for corporate espionage. But I do not believe we've seen any reduction in their zeal to use their cyber force to go after U.S. companies and companies around the world, exploit that IP, and then be able to use that for commercial gain.
And Mr. Brown, do you agree that Russia also is a cyber threat to the United States?
There's no question about it. They both have very strong capabilities.
I just saw today on Facebook a congressional candidate in Alabama posted that in the last 7 days, she's had 1,100, through her Facebook analytics, 1,100 blocked attacks by the Russians. In the next country, I think, is in like the double digits. So do we believe that China, because of what Russia was able to do in 2016, is emboldened that maybe they could push further with their influence campaigns or their cyber attacks against us?
There's no question that there's tremendous capability, Russia versus China. Russia tends to be using their capability in a different way.
Could China, though, if they wanted to, be just as effective as Russia was?
I believe so.
Thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
If I might add to that quickly, I think certainly in the aftermath of the APT-1 report, which exposed Unit 61398 of the People's Liberation Army, there was a decrease in hacking, but it was temporary. The activities were disrupted. There was a response to the indictment of a number of PLA officers as well, but the threat has been transformed, but it hasn't in any way been mitigated. If anything, Chinese hackers have improved their operational security and the sophistication of their operations. There's been a change in the pattern of activities with a restructuring of Chinese military cyber forces under the Strategic Support Force, of greater activities from the Ministry of State Security at this point, including the recent hack of a Navy contractor last week. So I think, if anything, the effect of that has been to expose to Chinese leaders that they needed to really step up their game and make these activities harder to detect. And on the question of interference or influence, I think certainly China has been watching and has recognized the impact of the tactics that Russia has pursued. We may see similar operations undertaken by China, either via entities like the United Front Work Department or through PLA directly going forward, and some of those might start out by targeting countries like Taiwan or China's neighbors in Southeast Asia. So if we want to see where that threat is going, we should look in China's own backyard, because that's where they'll start.
Thank you, Ms. Kanye. And
Just to
so we
further
can make our
answer-
votes.
I'm
Sorry,
gonna have
sir.
to,
You
I'm gonna have
yield
to-
back. Thanks, Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and I think we're out of time on the clock on the floor, so we have to run and vote. But I want to thank all of you for your testimony. I apologize for getting cut short, but it's fascinating. The members will have 5 days to extend questions to all of you, and I know that you'll cooperate in responding to those questions, and we really appreciate all 4 of your time today. It's been very enlightening on a very important subject. So with that, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.